Alright, so we just got done talking about improvisation. Now let's talk a little bit more again about the ensembles that we were just hinting at earlier on. Now with ensembles, they can change and their size can vary when we look at different jazz eras in jazz history. When we first start to look at jazz here in the first week or so, we're going to find that these ensembles were relatively smaller, maybe 5 to 7 instruments. You might have a couple wind instruments, and you would have a rhythm section. So, for example, you could have, let's see what a traditional New Orleans group would be. You'd have a trumpet player, a clarinet player, and a trombone player being what's called the front line. They'd be the wind instruments. And then the second line, which would be considered the rhythm section, you would probably have piano, bass, drums, maybe guitar, maybe banjo. But at least I think you'd probably have piano, bass, and drums. Okay? And the main role for this smaller group, beginning group in jazz history, looking at New Orleans jazz, was for exploring improvisation. They did have a concept of melody down, and what they kind of did is they did more of a flourish on what the melody was, and not just like out and out, play the melody and then everyone sit back and have just one player solo for a couple of choruses. It was kind of more like a shared thing where a lot of them would just go ahead and improv together, like a shared improvisation kind of thing, which is very typical of a New Orleans type of music, where you get shared polyphony of melody and also shared polyphony of improvisation. Okay, now as we get more recent, jazz ensembles started to grow and big bands started to explode from these combo groups. Alright, so instead of having 5 to 7 musicians, what they would do is they would start to double or triple or add 4 or 5 of the same instruments together. So now, instead of having, like, say, one trumpet, one clarinet or saxophone, or one trombone, they would grow out to now 5 saxophone, 4 trombone, 4 trumpets, and a full rhythm section of piano, guitar, bass, and drums. So the guitar would probably most likely be there. And this was definitely for more of a compositional technique and made things a lot fuller. You could have a lot more background things going on, and it became a lot, the music just became a lot fuller. And it was mainly also as a motivation for more dance music too. It became popular in the 1930s, and then they died down a little after World War II, and now as far as big bands, you probably would see them more in university groups. So there are still a couple professional groups that are touring out there, but now more so with big bands, they're university groups, or they might be community groups as well. For the big bands, as far as how songs were, they were arranged. There wasn't a song and solos, kind of like what was happening with New Orleans music, where you'd play the melody and then you'd have shared improvisation. A lot of it, if not all of it, was actually written out, so it'd be kind of more of the traditional concert band or marching band, if you will, situation, where everyone had a specific part written out for them to play. But solos were still somewhat important, and they might be inserted into various parts of the song. So you might say have the whole band play, like one chorus, and then you might have maybe the saxophones doing a background figure while the trumpet or trombone plays a little solo. So it was still there, but everything was arranged at this point. Okay, again with big bands, the musicians they often dressed formally. The front man was the one who directed the band and would announce the tunes. And as I alluded to earlier, these big bands were mainly for playing dances. There were also concerts too, but when big bands started to grow, it was more to support the dance craze that started to bloom. And members of these big band groups were not well known to the general public. Like in New Orleans groups, you might be able to name who the trumpet player of the group was and who the clarinet player of the group was and so on. When we got into big bands, usually you're not going to know most of the people in the band. They weren't like American Idols, if you will. But when we look back in history and we look at famous bands like a Duke Ellington band or a Count Basie band, we start to name off specific players because of their contributions that they made. But during that period, they were really not known that well to the general public. And speaking of the public, the audience, the typical audience that you would find for jazz music. The behavior of the audience would be between listening to classical music and rock music. Okay, the venues that they would play in could be dance halls, could be concert halls, or if we're looking at smaller groups or combos, would be in small clubs. Now, some clubs, smaller clubs, would forbid talking during performances, so they kind of play the role of kind of like a concert hall. Okay, and this started happening after the swing era, when bebop started to come along, and you'd find a lot more playing going on in small clubs, and people would show up just to listen to the music. Some would try to dance, but usually they would have signs up saying no dancing allowed, which is kind of interesting. As far as the audience participation, they originally only applauded for really great solos. So in other words, you might hear solos a lot, especially like, say, a big band group might have 3 solos within one piece, you know, and it might just go by and no one may acknowledge them. And then someone like really huge might do this just stupendous solo, and at that point, you know, the audience would say, hey, yeah, that was definitely hip, and they would definitely applaud for that. But now that's kind of morphed, and now the tradition when we listen to jazz music, both in a combo setting or in a big band setting, is kind of to applaud for most solos. And that kind of also depends on the mood of the music. If we're listening to more of a ballad kind of music, you might not hear applauding after improvisation solos. But for faster solos, you might hear applauding for for most of the solos that occur. And you could kind of think of this as if you were a parent watching your son or daughter, at their high school jazz band concert. And, when you listen to those solos, they're not quite up to par yet. And obviously some of them might not be that good. But, to be nice, the tradition now would be to applaud after all those solos. Okay? So that's how the audience would behave. So now, you've checked out 3 different lectures. Hopefully you've taken some notes on these things. Your job now is to review the reading that you've done with chapters 1 and chapters 2. And then our first quiz coming up here is going to be on chapter 1 and chapter 2. So I've put some notes here as far as what we have covered in the other lectures, talking about breath rhythm, speech rhythm, rubato rhythm, talking about texture types, being homophonic, monophonic, or polyphonic, and also song form, which we just touched on here, dealing with 12-bar blues or 32-bar pop song form. And also through these lectures, I've tried to use songs that are with your 4-CD set, and I've got the list of songs right here. What I will also do is probably post a little review sheet that will just highlight the topics that we've talked about in these 3 lectures, and also give you a list of this. Now, for the test, I may not choose all these songs, but definitely make sure that you review these. And yes, when you're taking your test, the way I've got it set up, you'll be able to play a little audio excerpt from these songs within the actual question, and then you'll have to answer something about those songs, whether it be it's a good example of homophonic texture, or this is an example of speech rhythm, or this would be a 12-bar blues form. Okay, so, and that will be listed in your book too as far as some of those topics. So with that in mind, make sure you're studying and be ready for your first quiz coming up. See ya.